Good morning and welcome to the Sunday Supplement. This evening, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, will lay out a roadmap for Britain's recovery from COVID-19. Of course, football itself is attempting to navigate its return with Project Restart, as far as the Premier League is concerned, but there are plenty of bumps in the road ahead. Indeed, our colleagues at Sky Sports News are reporting that Brighton Hove Albion have now said they have a third player just test positive for the virus. To discuss this and much, much more, we are joined this morning by Mark Ogden, senior reporter at ESPN. Also by Paul Hayward, the chief sports writer at The Telegraph, and Andy Dunn, the chief sports writer at The Mirror. Now, before we talk to the guys, let's just have a quick look at the headlines this morning and get a flavour of what's in today's newspapers. Bundesliga could be a big setback there. Their plans to restart thrown into fresh doubt last night when second division Dynamo Dresden were placed into quarantine. And they've said they cannot train or play for the next 2 weeks, having been ordered to self-isolate. In the Mail, I think this is Rob Draper's piece, the Football League will announce next week that there will be no further games in Leagues 1 and 2, but the playoffs could still take place. The Championship remains in the balance, and the EFL are consulting clubs as to how best to award promotion and relegation spots in Leagues 1 and 2. Most likely a points per game system. Paul Barber from Brighton Hove Albion has been extensively quoted, and he, as well as reporting later on that they have a third player tested for coronavirus, he says, we have to be careful that we do not misstep here, because if we do, it could ruin lives. It could cost lives, and we cannot afford that. Away from the coronavirus itself, in the Times, Lou Van Gaal blames, in his words, the evil genius Ed Woodward for his Manchester United dismissal. So I'll start with Andy Dunn, the man who questioned the Secretary of State himself, Dominic Raab, earlier this week. Andy, could both Bundesliga and that Brighton Hove Albion news this morning be game changers in terms of what is a very, very important week ahead for football?
You know what, Geoff, I don't think they're necessarily game changers. They are just indicative of the type of hurdles that are going to have to be surmounted if you want to get football back on. I mean, talking about the Germany one, you know, there were 3 players from Cologne at the start of the month who tested positive for coronavirus, yet they still carried on training. The local health authority gave them permission, and they are scheduled to open their Bundesliga season again. To resume their Bundesliga season against Mainz on next Sunday, I believe. So local health authorities in different regions in Germany are reacting differently. Now, clearly in the case of the latest Brighton player to test positive, they won't have resumed team training yet, obviously. So it might be that he just has to self-isolate. And these are all, they're all problems, they're all barriers that we know that are going to be put up. They're absolutely, without doubt, we know they are going to be put up and they're going to be tough to get over. But the thing is, you mentioned here about asking that question of Dominic Raab. I think the reason why Number 10 asked the sports reporter to come and ask a question at that briefing was because they wanted to get out there. Listen, he didn't know the question I was going to ask, but he's got a fair idea that they ask a chief sports writer from a tabloid newspaper to come and ask a question. They're going to ask about the Premier League. And sure enough, that's what I did. And he was obviously ready to say, listen, we wanted to come back. We wanted to lift the spirits of the nation, which Oliver Dowden repeated on Friday. And it's quite clear from everything that the feedback we get from the government is they want this to go ahead. And the Premier League, obviously, for financial reasons, if nothing else, wanted to go ahead. So basically, the will is there of government and football to get it back on. They know that they are going to have issues like this that are going to come up every single day. You know, so last night, the Bundesliga, today, the Brighton issue, and they're going to have to go, whether or not they can be surmounted, these hurdles, remains to be seen. But I think the underlying point, certainly from the government this week, is that they will do all they can to help the Premier League get this back on.
Andy, top work from you, speaking to Dominic Raab personally, but can you confirm, or I can either pay compliment to your very elegant background, or can you confirm you have actually left Downing Street?
I'm sorry, I just didn't catch that last bit, Geoff. But can I find that out? Yes, as I say, I just thought for Dominic Raab, I just thought I don't want to overwhelm him with too many football books in the background, and just give him a little bit of sort of just a bit of soothing ornaments in the background to mix with the weighty tomes. One of which, of course, is Sir Alex Ferguson's biography, ghosted by our very fellow guest, Mr. Hayward.
Okay, that's enough of the loving. Far too much. Paul, how do you see this week mapping out, as it were? We've got the Premier League tomorrow, and of course, really important discussions for the EFL.
Yeah, I agree with Andy. As soon as the government, indicated very clearly its desire to get football back on, it was going to get back on. I think the Bundesliga will serve as the laboratory, really, for all the technical issues at stake. And the Premier League is quite lucky, really, that the Bundesliga is coming back first, because they can use the lessons from that to get their own operation right. So we know it's coming back. I personally think that's a good thing within limits. I think there's a degree of acceptable risk in life, and I think if those risks can be managed medically and scientifically, I think we should be looking towards this resumption in June. Having said that, nothing is straightforward in English football. There's always a bun fight. It's turning slightly into an episode of EastEnders, isn't it, with battles about neutral venues and relegation and so on. And that I understand as well, because
Paul just seems to have frozen for a moment there. Mark, perhaps, hopefully we'll get Paul back. Mark, how much do you think, just picking up where Paul left off there, that the very unity of the Premier League is being tested by these current times?
Well, it's being tested, obviously, by, self-interest is the first issue, because everybody has to look after their own issues. Brighton have got their issues, Watford have theirs, totally different to what Liverpool's issues are at the top of the table. So everybody has to make sure that they safeguard their future. So I can understand why clubs like, Brighton, West Ham, Watford are resistant to playing at neutral venues, why they're citing safety issues, because, first of all, they're thinking of the safety issues, but beyond that, the future of their club is at stake, because relegation from the Premier League at any time is disastrous for a club. But at this time, when we don't even know when next season will start and how next season will look and how difficult it'll be to raise, even to sell season tickets, going out of the Premier League this season will be an absolute hammer blow for any club that suffers that. So I can see why these clubs are fighting tooth and nail to protect their self-interest. But I agree with Paul that, football has to come back. And there are people out there that say football shouldn't come back. Why should football be any different to anything else? But industry and society will come back at some point, and we're talking about early mid-June. So life has to go on, and there will be risk involved. The risk is involved with everything. Football has always carried risk. Footballers have always gone onto a football pitch with the element of risk, and I think as long as that risk isn't beyond the realms of acceptability, I think we have to take the risk, because football is a massive industry. It generates so much money for the exchequer. The gambling industry, which is alongside it, generates a lot of tax for the government as well. But beyond that, I think there's 100,000 jobs related to football in this country, whether it's players, it's staff, it's cleaners, it's groundsmen, it's people who work on the match day. This isn't an insignificant industry, so it has to come back, and there will be risk, and there will not be a smooth way to coming back, because any element of society going forward will have difficulties. We're talking about having, 10 people on buses, so we have to accept life is going to be different, and that extends to football.
Paul, hopefully we've got you back now, but do you think it's in some ways difficult for the likes of Paul Barber at Brighton to get his point across without sounding like it's only self-centred and self-interest? He raises some very, very valid points with regards to neutral venues, safety compliance, and also statistically proven that there is an advantage to playing at home as well. But in these current times, the way, if you like, this is coming out, it's immediately labelled self-interest.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we forget sometimes that the Premier League is many worlds within one world. The interests of Liverpool and Manchester City aren't always compatible with the interests of Norwich and Brighton. And I have absolutely no problem with those clubs defending their interests and not wanting to get sort of steamrolled into a formula that doesn't work for them and puts them at risk of relegation. I do understand that. I think there's a problem. The big resumption problem is one of perception, really. We understand that it's about the industry, it's about jobs, it's about livelihoods, it's about raising the spirits of the country. But I don't think that message is getting across really. You listen to people out there and they think it's about money. They think it's about TV contracts and so on. And the Premier League has got to be better at persuading people that this is really not just about money. It's about jobs and livelihoods.
Andy, the other thing as well, there's been a dearth of comment from the Premier League itself, but all of a sudden over the weekend, you've got Christian Purslow, you've got Scott Duxbury and Paul Barber, who's already been speaking out about this. We had Steve Parrish wrote a very eloquent column last week. Do you feel now that clubs, which is great news for newspapers and media outlets, clubs really are desperate, is probably the wrong word, but very, very keen to get their point across?
Yes, Geoff, it's very interesting that the Brighton, while from some quarters are getting some criticism for their stance, particularly on the neutral venue issue, it has to be said that Paul Barber and Dan Ashworth and Graham Potter, they have been actually at the forefront. They've been the ones who've been communicating week in, week out. They communicate every single week to a virtual presser, which not many clubs do. And also what you would have to say as well is there's been no central comments. I mean, a lot of people have maybe suggested they had Richard Scudamore, for example, still been at the helm. There might have been more authoritative direction from the Premier League itself, from its head office, from those who coordinate the league itself. But I think what's interesting is that those who have been vocal, Scott Duxbury obviously writing the letter published on Saturday morning, obviously Paul Barber, Christian Purslow has been vocal on it. So what we're actually seeing are clubs that are basically in danger of relegation, speaking out. We haven't yet heard a great deal from those who wield the power, basically the big six, for example. We've had bits and bobs from Ed Woodward, but not a massive amount from those. And I think it's good to hear from it. It would be good after this next meeting, rather than, much as it is great for us as newspapers, it's brilliant. The leaks, the briefings behind the scenes, they're all good and they make good copy. I think it probably would be good if everyone came out, and had a pretty open discussion about these things. Because at the moment, the main people that we're hearing from are basically who you might want to call the Gang of Six, who don't want to play at neutral venues, and whose only caveat for playing at neutral venues would seem to be the abolition of relegation for this season.
Mark, how much? I don't even know if a Gang of Six actually exists, but I know exactly what Andy is referring to there. Good. Mark, how much though? How much do you think that Gang of Six will be tested? Let's just say, for whatever reason, football doesn't resume in the Premier League. It goes to a points per basis, and so the bottom three are automatically relegated. What do you think the three above would have to say then? Where would Brighton, for instance, stand there? Now, Brighton said all along they want the season to resume. But what would happen then in terms of solidarity?
I imagine the Gang of Six would become a gang of two sets of threes, and the bottom three will be fighting just like the clubs are fighting at the minute to avoid neutral venues and what have you. The teams that are above the bottom three will be quite happy for the season to be settled on average points. I think that's what it's all about. It is all about survival, and when it boils down to the motivation, those six clubs know that if it becomes a bottom three, then three of them will be fine. So I don't think there'll be much solidarity in that aspect. But I think they are in danger of losing the argument a little bit, because every time we hear the reasons against playing, it does sound like finding excuses. And obviously the biggest reason is safety. But we're talking about players don't want to come back, players don't want to be locked away for a week beforehand. I mean, I had a conversation with somebody the other day. They were at a club, and they were saying they're getting 10 WhatsApp messages a day from players asking when are we coming back. There are a lot of players who want to play again, but it just sounds at the moment like the majority of players don't want to play. But I'm hearing that loads of players want to come back because it's their livelihood, and there's also resentment towards the sense that those who don't want to play are seemingly carrying the argument a little bit, because whether they don't want to play because they don't want to get relegated, lose their kind of massive pay packets, or worried about their futures in terms of which club they might be at. Now, clearly there's a safety issue involved. There always has to be with coronavirus. But I think that almost like the silent majority of players who want to play again need to be heard, because it is about their livelihoods. It's about the livelihoods of people at the clubs. It is about the sense of the feel-good factor of a nation. There are a lot of people who are missing football, and yes, the safety of relatives and family members is key, but people want an escape, and football offers that.
Okay, we have to take a break right now, but afterwards we're discussing the EFL, who we understand are set to announce this week no more football in Leagues 1 and 2, with the Championship in the balance. Welcome back to the Sunday Supplement. We understand that the EFL this week will announce there'll be no more action whatsoever in Leagues 1 and 2. The Championship itself still in the balance. So for Leagues 1 and 2, they have to decide upon a system, and it looks likely to be on a points per game basis, but not home and away, which has already unleashed all sorts of debate, indeed argument. Andy Dunn, Chief Sports Writer at the Mirror, this is not going to be easy to negotiate, is it? Andy, I think we've lost you.
Geoff.
I think we've lost you for technical.
Oh, no.
I think we've got. You got us back.
I think I've just got you. You were talking about Leagues 1 and 2 and how they're going to settle this season. Now it's going to be abandoned.
Correct.
I mean, listen, it is going to be tough. I mean, my worry for League 1 and 2 is not the fact that it's going to be cancelled, and not how they are going to navigate their way through the promotion and relegation issues. My worry is when are they going to come back, and how this absence is affecting them, because these are clubs clearly whose existence relies on the revenue that comes through on match days, very much more so than obviously clubs are higher up the pyramid. I think in terms of how it's going to be decided, this PPG. I mean, at one stage it looked like Duckworth Lewis were going to get involved, didn't it? I mean, it really did. This home and away, the weighted home and away actually makes a little bit of sense to me. I mean, which works out that they take your average points from your home games and apply them to your remaining home games, and likewise with the away games, which of course would make. If it was applied to the Premier League, by the way, I think it'd mean that West Ham would finish in the bottom three. So there's no chance, I don't think, of the Premier League ever adopting this system. But it seems a relatively fair system to me. Even just a normal points per game average would seem fair. And I do think there's probably... I don't think it will provoke the sort of legal backlash that you would expect higher up the pyramid. I think clubs in League 1 and League 2 now are probably at their wits' end, and they want an end to this. They want a quick end to this. And they want to start formulating plans of how they are going to come back in, whether it be a few months' time, more likely the start of next year, more likely a year's time, who knows? And I think the long-term implications for these clubs are far more immense and need far more consideration than the short-term issues of who's promoted, who's relegated, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, there are clubs who are beginning to look at the next 12 months and maybe not even play for another 12 months, because I think it was Bradford last week suspended season ticket sales because they've been told that they can't expect fans inside the stadiums for the rest of this year. So how can they sell season tickets? How can they generate the money that... I mean, clubs in the lower leagues will be killed if they come back and play football in the next few weeks, because they can't afford to play football with no money coming to the turnstiles, because they will have to pay wages, bonuses, win bonuses, appearance money. So for them, they have to end the season. But the long-term issue for those clubs is how do they survive the next 12 months? Because if they face, even if it's the next 6 months without fans coming through the turnstiles, they can't pay the wages. Now, in League 2, I think the average player salary is £1,200 a week, which to the average man on the street, that is a decent wage. But at a football club, it's hard to generate the funds to pay that money to a squad of 20 players. So I can understand why EFL Leagues 1 and 2 have to call it a day, because the safest way for them to get through the next 6 or 12 months is perhaps to mothball the clubs, and unfortunately for a lot of players say, look, sorry, but when your contract ends on the 30th of June, we can't afford to pay you next season. We're going to have to ride this out. And I think this is one thing that people, obviously for the priority is the here and now, but what people aren't realising is that when this season is ended, however it ends, next season is going to be so disrupted, certainly the lower leagues, that we might not see Leagues 1 and 2 next season. We might have to wait until August 2021 before we see the likes of, Accrington, Rochdale, these teams play again, because it's going to be so difficult to play without fans going through the turnstiles.
Yeah, I watched Rick Parry's appearance for the DCMS this week, and there was some really shocking and frightening statistics in there. And Mark is right. The League's 1 and 2 clubs will actually cost them money to play football in the next 3 or 4 months. For example, the wage bill of the Football League clubs is about £1 billion a year. Their income from television is 100 million. They rely on gate money for about 36% of their income. Playing behind closed doors for lower league clubs is a disastrous proposition because it will actually cost them, and that's on top of the medical and scientific costs of testing and so on, which I see this morning there's some suggestion that the Premier League might help them with, but it's a non-starter, I think, for those bottom 2 leagues to resume. The Championship is another interesting case because there, wages are running on average at 106% of turnover. So the Championship business model just doesn't make any sense at all, particularly in this climate. And we do fixate with the Premier League, understandably, but of course more people watch Football League football than they do Premier League football, and there's an awful lot of people out there worried about their club and whether they can survive this kind of turbulence. Personally, I think points per game is a nonsensical. It's a completely arbitrary and random way of deciding the season. But at the same time, I do understand that there is no ideal resolution, particularly when it comes to promotion and relegation.
While we are talking about clubs who are going to struggle to survive, the people I'm speaking to, the players in the lower leagues are desperate to play again because their career is their career. They operate to short 1 or 2 year contracts. They're not on lucrative 5 year contracts, which you see in the Premier League. And there is a kind of growing sense of resentment in the lower leagues to the noises coming out of the Premier League. And somebody said to me, it's okay, telling people from your poolside villa on your holiday home that you don't want to play again. But, talk about a guy that's got 2 kids, a mortgage, and he doesn't know when his next contract's going to be. If you play in League 1 and League 2 and the season ends, then you might be at work for a year. Now, there are very few players in the low leagues with second jobs, and there are some, and some have been quite smart in terms of thinking ahead. But the vast majority of footballers in Leagues 1 and 2 survive solely on their income from football. If they're not going to play for a year, they can't survive on being furloughed for a year because it won't cover the cost. So, again, this is a big issue down in the lower leagues whereby the clubs can't really contemplate playing, but the players can't contemplate not playing. So that's another issue which has to be addressed in this whole mess.
And what's interesting is, go on, Paul.
No, I was just going to say that the Football League clubs as well have got Deloitte looking at their accounts. The reason for that is they want to be able to go to the players and say, none of these figures add up, we're in dire straits. And they're hoping that the players will then say, oh yeah, sorry, we didn't realise, we didn't look at the books properly. And now we've understood that argument, we'll all take a 50% pay cut next time around. My worry is that in the end, it's the players who will pick up the bill for the financial mismanagement of Football League clubs over decades.
Andy, what's interesting about this EFL proposal, though, if it's points per game and it's not weighted, as in what they picked up on average home games and away games. Now, Darren McAntony, the owner of Peterborough, has already allegedly threatened legal action because if it's points per game, then they are in the playoffs. And as we understand it, the EFL would still have playoff finals at Wembley. But if it's not weighted, Peterborough drop out of the playoffs and Wycombe are the team that benefits. So has he got a good case to argue there?
Yes, Geoff, and that's where the legal issues will come in, because whichever system you have, whether it be points per game or whether it be weighted points per game, there's going to be a fundamental principle, and the fundamental principle is going to be that you actually wouldn't have known how the rest of the season would pan out in terms of for example the strength of opposition against a team. The strength of the opponents that you've got to face, the injuries that you had in the squad, the injuries other teams might have had in the squad. The bottom line is that whether it be League One, League Two, Championship or Premier League, no one knew such are the vagaries of a football game that no one knew how the remaining 9, 10, 11 fixtures, wherever it may be throughout the leagues, would have worked out. So you are always going to have a grievance. There's just no getting away from that. There's always going to be a grievance one way or another. The fact of the matter is you have two options. You find a system, whether it be points per game, weighted points per game, or you call the whole thing off, or you say it's null and void, there's no promotion, no relegation. In the Premier League, there's no champions, there's no relegation. They are the only two things. There are going to be issues with whatever system you come up with, other than you null and void it. As simple as that. They're the only options that you have on the table.
But Mark, if you accept Paul Barber's point that it is statistically proven that there is an advantage to playing at home, why would you not have a weighted system that allows for home and away? Even though, of course, it doesn't tell us everything. It is artificial. We accept that. If it was based on this sort of thing, then we'd never had the great escape from West Brom or whatever. It is rewriting the rule book. We're losing all the drama associated with end of season. But can you see an argument as to why it shouldn't be a weighted system, as Anthony McDonough says?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it depends where you've played, which away games you've played. If you've played the bottom 10 away from home, but you've not played the top 10 away from home, your figures will be kind of different because of that. There's no perfect solution. I think this is one thing that we've realised in every aspect. People are going to have to give up. Everybody's going to have to give up something to find a resolution of this season. Do you wait home and away? Do you just have? There is some suggestion, I think, in the National League where I think they're going to decide the situation this week, whereby it could be decided on the first 19 games of the season. So the halfway point of the season, do it that way. That's unfair because you've only played the top. You maybe played the top team away, but the bottom team's at home. I don't think there's an ideal solution, but I do understand that if a club misses out on the basis of a weighted home and away system, then they probably would, of course, would have a right to challenge it because it would be unfair on them.
So, Paul, what's going to break the deadlock?
Well, the deadline, really. The deadline is fast approaching. It's at the end of the month. UEFA has said that leagues have to decide by, I think, May 25th, isn't it?
Correct.
It's really getting to the point now where they can't delay these decisions any longer. The problem they've got is that they've got these technical arguments about how to do it, but they've also got these this disunity in the Premier League about what should be done. I think the fans actually are probably still unclear about some of the reasoning here, particularly in relation to neutral venues. They're reading stuff in newspapers, leaks and briefings about the case for and against neutral venues, but there's a lot of information that the Premier League hasn't spelt out yet. So supporters, much as in society generally, when the government messages keep changing from one day to the next, I don't think the public are clear about what the Premier League is thinking because they're half trying to do it privately and they're half briefing people like us, which is keeping us in business, and we're very grateful for it. But I don't think supporters, Geoff, understand quite what is really going on behind the scenes. And it will be a good day, I think, for everybody when the Premier League is able to sit down and say, these are the reasons why we have taken these decisions.
Mark, if that decision has already been made but not announced with regard to Leagues 1 and 2, how much would you expect the Championship to follow suit?
I think the Championship would wait as long as possible before they have to take that step. But again, there'll be a lot of clubs in the Championship who are facing financial difficulty in the sense that playing behind closed doors will be disastrous for them. So I wouldn't be surprised if two or three weeks down the line we get to a situation where the Championship follows League 1 and 2, but they will find a way to get the playoffs done. Obviously got the thorny issue at the top with Leeds and West Brom. I think that Leeds are 7 points clear of third place, West Brom are 6 points clear of Fulham. But Fulham would argue that with a 6 point gap to West Brom, they could climb at the top two. But it may be a case of having to settle the top two and then play off the remaining four. But it's always a very tight league, that the Championship. So there'll be clubs probably down at 10th or 11th that say you're denying us a chance of a playoff place. But I do think that inevitably the Championship will follow suit in the weeks to come because it's going to be so difficult to get. I mean, it's a 24-team league. You talk about over 100 games to play, and nobody's even addressed the issue of neutral venues in the Championship. So, one of the big issues with neutral venues in the Premier League is the fear of fans congregating at outside games. And Liverpool haven't won the title for 30 years. When they win the title, there is a concern that there'll be thousands of Liverpool fans turning up, which in ordinary times would happen. Now that's going to be dealt with by neutral venues. But what happens in the Championship if Leeds play at Ellen Road and they win promotion back to the Premier League for the first time in 16 years. How are they going to police that? How are they going to stop Leeds fans turning up en masse? And these are the issues that have to be addressed in the Championship, just as they have to be addressed in the Premier League. So whenever you find a solution, you find a problem.
Well, there are many obstacles in the way, which we'll discuss after this break. So stay with us. This is the Sunday Supplement. Of course, we are talking about football's returning. But I want to ask a question to our three guests right now. First of all, do you actually personally believe that football should return? And secondly, what sort of reaction have you had from people you've spoken to or people who have contacted you with the stories you're running, whether they be negative or positive? What's your sense of the mood? But first of all, we'll start with you, Andy. Do you think football should be started playing again, bearing in mind the fairly obvious potential risks?
I think it's a really good question, Geoff. And, strangely enough, my position has changed. And I actually think your opinion is allowed to develop. Right at the start of this, my first position was that there should be null and voided. That this was a consequence of something that we couldn't foresee. Well, some people might have been able to foresee, and the thing should have been null and voided. And then after that became clear that wasn't going to happen, I was pretty much against returning football in some sort of biosecure bubble. I was actually, listen, let's not play until it's safe enough for fans to go along. Now, that soon becomes clear that isn't going to be for a long, long time. But that's still my point of view, and I don't like this idea of playing in these, sterilised, biosecure environments. But then as time goes on, I'm actually thinking, you know what? Actually, the more this goes on, and of course, when you're in lockdown, your mind works overtime, and you can change emotions, change moods. And as time goes on, I've actually sort of come to think that, you know what? While I don't agree with the government ministers that football will suddenly lift the whole spirit of the nation and we'll all be getting out bunting and sort of having a great time. That won't be the case. The spirit of the nation will only be lifted when basically the death rate is tumbling, when there's more PPE, when there's more testing, and when there's a vaccine on the horizon. That's when the spirit of the nation will be lifted. But will football be a welcome distraction? Will football be, something to fill this really unbelievably anxious void in people's lives, if only for a few hours? And I think it would. And you know what? I watched that game. I watched the Korean game on Friday morning, and I tuned in specifically just to see how ghastly it would be. And those of us, some of us have covered a couple of closed doors games, including one with England in. But I was going to see how this would come across on television and how utterly, awful it would be. And you know what? It wasn't. I was intrigued by the game. I watched the game for 90. It wasn't the best. It was decent enough entertainment. A late winner from a 41-year-old, a sending off for a studs-up challenge. There was nothing different in the game. Even the piped-in crowd noise. After a couple of minutes, you sort of got used to it. And it was a distraction. For me on Friday morning, whoever it was, I can't remember, Chung Bung against Suwon Blue Wings, it was actually a distraction for me. So imagine what Liverpool versus Manchester City would be, even though it's behind closed doors, even though, and of course, all of these are with the proviso that we make it as safe as possible. And as Mark alluded to in the programme, we can't make it completely safe. But with the risk minimalised as much as you can, would Liverpool v Man City, televised, albeit in front of 350 people in the Etihad? I mean, it won't be much quieter. Would that be a distraction for everyone that we'd all like? I think now it would. My view's changed, and my view is that I think Premier League should try and get back, should try and do all they can, minimise the risks, and get back.
Yeah. I agree with Dunny. I was the same at the outset. I thought it'd be impractical. It'd be wrong to play again. I thought there was too much for society to deal with. I thought, we're almost 2 months into lockdown now, and it felt like that football was the last thing in anybody's minds. But as we're seeing, every kind of industry is now trying to, tiptoe its way out of this problem and find a way back. And I don't see why football should be any different to anybody else. Why should football, have special treatment? Again, we all talk about football as should they get special treatment, but if footballers are saying, well, it's not safe for us to play, well, what about the average person in the street who has to go back to work? The bus driver, the frontline workers who are having to face challenges every day. to go back to work. So, the football when it comes back will be incredibly safe. It won't be totally safe. Nothing ever is, but it's going to be such a sterile laboratory-based environment that every risk will be kind of factored in. So I think footballers, in a sense, maybe have a duty to the rest of the nation to say, look, we're trying to make our way back from this. You can too, and lead that way rather than the constant stories about footballers not wanting to do this or that. Again, I reiterate, the people I've spoken to, that the vast majority of players want to play again because it's their livelihood, it's their escape from them. They don't want to be at home just watching their careers drift away. One Premier League club told me that they've done a kind of a straw poll of players, and every single player wanted to play again. So, yes, players will have concerns and issues. There were players that have family members with underlying health problems. Well, the way that people have to deal with that, perhaps they might have to give these players compassionate leave if they don't feel it's safe because of family issues. It's happened before. I remember Man United gave Edwin van der Sar compassionate leave a few years ago when his wife had a brain hemorrhage. That football has to treat these cases as they arise and deal with it in its own way. Football can't be held to ransom, I guess, by a small group of players who don't want to play.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember as well that it's not just us. I mean, German horse racing has already resumed. French horse racing is meant to be resuming on Monday. The Bundesliga is days away from coming back. In Spain, La Liga is coming back in June. And of course, in Spain, they had one of the strictest lockdowns of all, where people couldn't leave their homes for 6 weeks except to go and get food. So I think it's not just the supposed arrogance of English football. I think we should see it as an industry issue. Later on, the Prime Minister is going to, announce one or two measures possibly to get some industries moving again, maybe garden centres and picnics. I sometimes think Enid Blyton is writing the resumption rules in this country. But anyway, it's the thing is that football as an industry is entitled to say, how can we get going again safely and properly, as any other industry could? And I don't think it should be necessarily shamed into thinking that it's doing something dishonourable. The difference, of course, is that football involves close physical contact, and that's still a problem which is still very hazy in people's minds. When you start thinking about the ball coming into the box from a corner and grappling and shoveling and shoving and nudging and pushing, you're going to, that still doesn't sit very well with most of us. Another problem, of course, is that there's this idea out there that football would be taking scarce resources away from the NHS in terms of PPE and testing kits and so on, and getting special treatment, as it were. Well, there are details emerging now about the privately funded nature of that. There's a firm in Hong Kong that's meant to be providing £4 million worth of equipment to the Premier League for testing. Again, you can argue about whether that's ethical or not. But, if football can persuade the public that this just isn't just about money, it's about trying to fight your way out of this corner that we've all been in for the last 2 months, and picking an industry back up and giving people some form of entertainment and distraction, something that makes them feel better about the world and life, then I would be in favour of that.
Okay, Paul, I want to pick up on something you said there and also throw something else you said to Andy straight off the back of it. Mm. First of all, if you're being brutally honest, Paul, this somewhat hasty, how much is the return for football, except in all industries are trying to get back to some sort of business, some sort of normality, although I'm not entirely sure what that phrase means anymore. But how much do you think the speed at which football is being brought back is down entirely to its precarious finances?
I think that's the main motivation, Geoff. Yes, of course. I think the question of the TV contracts is uppermost in the minds of certainly the Premier League. And again, that's where the perception problem is. I think that feeling was there from the start in the general public, and it's going to be a difficult one for the Premier League to overcome, because if they make mistakes and the whole thing breaks down, there's going to be a terrible blow to the image of English football, which will be seen as presumptuous and over hasty and arrogant and disrespectful of the medical crisis we're all in. So that is a big issue for them. But in general, there are reasons beyond the TV contract, and we need to look at those fairly and not just I think be too obsessed with this idea that it's all about greed. Some of it is, but not all of it.
Andy, how does it sit with you, the talk of £4 million being spent with a company, I believe, called Pronetics for the testing kits? How do you think that will sit if those testing kits are still not as widely available as they should be to NHS and other key workers at the time, regardless of who pays for it?
It won't sit very well at all, and that is clearly what the Premier League have to take into account. I mean, don't forget, they are talking about a resumption in mid-June, June the 12th. I think it's a date that's been bandied about. So we are talking about a month away. So I assume that they can turn around to the government. So don't forget, they're in these discussions with the government. The Premier League can turn around and say, listen, hang on a minute. We've got a month here. Now, we're going to assume that in a month's time, when we kick off, then you will have all the testing that you need at that point. And clearly, if that's not the case, it's not going to sit well. Never mind getting into arguments that, well, it is essentially the government's fault that testing isn't there. It's nothing to do with the Premier League. And if they source them from somewhere else, well, that's what they do. It's wrong. I mean, clearly, it doesn't sit right. But I'm assuming that the Premier League have had these discussions with government ministers to say that the testing won't be a fundamental issue come in a month's time. So I think that's I think that's where the Premier League are coming from. I would just like just to go back on your initial question, Geoff, when you're saying about how do you find that we get the response that we get. Well, I find that if you say something sort of suggesting that football maybe should come back, then clearly there are a lot of people out there who've been touched. We know many people have been touched by tragedy. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, soon going into the millions who've been touched by the coronavirus tragedy. So they find it jars, understandably, that we might be talking about football coming back when the real human tragedy is unfolding grisly day by day. I understand that. And I would say that the newspapers as well, the sports pages, have vested interest in football coming back, actually been making sure that they have underlined every problem, every negative element. They're not cheerleaders for football coming back. But I don't think just because you say it will be a distraction and it will be something to take people's minds off the daily gloom, that you are being in any way disrespectful to people who have been sadly affected by this tragedy.
Geoff, just on that question you just asked to Dunny about how it sits with the Premier League, taking up these tests from Hong Kong. Well, football has to be careful it doesn't become the government's punch bag in all this, because, football cannot return until the government says it can return. It can't just return on its own back. It can't just do its own thing. So the government has to sanction the return to football. Now, if we get to the middle of June and the government suddenly finds that it's not got enough tests, surely it can commandeer the tests that are paid for by the Premier League. So the Premier League has to be careful, has to manage its own PR and message to make it clear that they are only coming back when they come back because the government said it's safe to do so. So let's just save football from the kicking it may get down the line, because the tests are there. If the government want to use the football test, I'm sure they can take them. The football will not stand in the way of the government taking tests if that's what the government requires. People need them.
But Mark, Paul has already preempted the headlines. If it comes back and it falls down, writ large, English football arrogance believes it could buck the trend, etc., there'll be no headlines saying, yeah, look, they gave it a go, but unfortunately it didn't work, because as you alluded to, and you skillfully avoided using the cliche political football, but I won't, it's going to get another kicking, isn't it? It's kind of damned if it does and damned if it doesn't.
Of course it is, which is probably why it needs to manage its message a bit better now, because everybody in football wants to come back. And yes, it is primarily a financial thing, but every business that is currently unable to function properly needs to come back primarily for financial reasons. Don't forget, people in football are people who've played football all their lives. It's their passion. It's what they want to do. They're lucky enough to be able to have a job, which is what their hobby was as kids. Even the administrators in the game, they all love football. It's all something that, they're passionate about. So they want to come back for reasons beyond finance as well. Yes, they will probably get a kicking down the line if the government finds that football has been, come back too soon. But I do think it's important to stress that if football comes back, when it comes back, it will only do so when the government gives it the green light. It won't go through a red light, which the government imposes.
OK, we're going to take a break right now, but afterwards we'll discuss what football might look like should and when it returns. Now, Now, of course, it's a ever-changing story, quite literally on a daily and sometimes even hourly basis. But at the moment, football is making plans to return, apart from Leagues 1 and 2, that is. Championship and the Premier League at the moment are making plans to return to action. So what might it look like when it returns? So, Andy, you watched the game the other night, which you spoke about, but potentially they're talking as well about 5 substitutes too. How different will this be? And how much appetite do you think there is to watch what we're potentially talking about here?
You know, I alluded to this. I initially had no appetite, particularly to watch biosecure football. I've now got quite a healthy appetite to watch it. I mean, I just watched that game. As I alluded before, it had a dramatic late winner. It had a sending off where the guy didn't agree with it, gave a bit of hint. You know, just things that were normal. Once they started playing, you know, it was a football game, competitive. As I say, it wasn't the best standard, but it was competitive. And it will be different. To start with, Geoff, when you mentioned the 5 subs, I mean, that's just an interesting side point, really, because although IFAB have said in all competitions you will be allowed to use 5 substitutes, the Premier League do have to vote on that because it is a law change in the Premier League's constitution. So they will tomorrow, that will be one of the few things they actually take a vote on tomorrow, will be to accept that you can take 5 subs. You can actually only do it in 3 stages. So you can't actually do 5 separate stages. But what's interesting about that is that it seems like, well, why wouldn't you accept the 5 sub rule? Well, the reason being, I guess, would be that it will clearly benefit those with stronger squads, i.e. the bigger clubs, i.e. the richer clubs. I mean, we often go to the Etihad and we look at a team sheet, and on the bench, you'll see, well, this was say, you know, when he was fit, you'll see Leroy Sané, you'll see Gabriel Jesus, you'll see Phil Foden, you might see Bernardo Silva, you know, and City, in theory, could actually, in one fell swoop, send 5 more attacking players out there, and clearly other clubs wouldn't have that privilege. So, although I think they will adopt the 5 sub rule, I don't think, you know, I think might be 1 or 2 who look at it and think, well, I'm not sure. But that will be one of the few logistical changes. The rest of it, you will just have to get, A, there is no crowd noise, B, that it will be artificial, the crowd noise is pumped in. But I think once the game starts, you know, it is a football match. Again, it is 11 versus 11. There's just no getting away from that. And I think that people, again, I've said before, that when Liverpool Man City, for example, live on Sky, behind closed doors or not, would be a competitive game and would get enormous amounts of interest and enormous amounts of viewers. And I just think that we will get used to it. It looks awkward. I mean, the thing on Friday as well, you know, they celebrate a goal with an elbow bump. Sometimes they forget themselves and pat each other on the back. But again, listen, apart from unprecedented times, the go-to phrase of lockdown has been the new normal, and that will be the new normal.
I think we all had a bit of a taste. Sorry, Paul.
It's okay, Mark. Yeah, I think the 5 substitute thing is understandable in the sense that there's a health and welfare issue here. Players, when those players walk back on the pitch, they're not going to be anywhere near fit. I don't care how good your home gym is, and I don't care how well run the training sessions are for a couple of weeks before the players get back on the pitch. So in a sense, having 5 substitutes will protect the players from injury and fatigue. But on the other hand, it just loads the dice again in favour of the rich and powerful clubs and the those in the bottom 6 who are potentially going to be put in this situation of fighting against relegation in neutral venues and so on, could face top 6 teams who are able to send on half a new team, as Andy said, you know, in the style of an NFL team or Eddie Jones's England at rugby, where he changes the whole scrum in one go virtually. So I would be against that. I think it would help the players physically in terms of their welfare, but it's just another distortion of the game as we've seen it up to this point of 29 games.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all had a taste of it when I think we all went to the England versus Croatia game in Croatia 18 months ago behind closed doors, and it was a really strange environment, and it was just, you know, that was strange enough. It was, you could hear the players shouting, you could hear all sorts of stuff going on at the side of the pitch, this echoing noise, but that, in a way, that will almost feel like different to what we're going to get, because the rules that are in place in Germany, for instance, include no hugs, no handshakes, no high fives when scoring goals. I mean, that's just, it just takes all the kind of the passion out of the game, but it has to be done that way. It has to be like football in a laboratory, because without that all these restrictions, the season isn't going to get finished. And this is the problem. It has to get finished for sporting integrity, for financial reasons, but it's going to be so different to what fans are used to. It's going to be cold, it's going to be clinical, but unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. And for it to get played, we have to accept these alien rules, really, in these strange times.
I mean, when you phrase it like that, Mark, I've got to say, and I'm obviously, I want to see football, but that doesn't sound very appetising to me.
No, exactly, and it's difficult to sell, isn't it? That you're going to watch a game where no handshakes, when you play football for that 90 minutes, it's a release, and I don't think it's possible to say to players, don't be patting your teammate on the back, or don't be doing this. Spitting. I mean, a lot of people are kind of aghast at spitting, but it happens on a football pitch. It's just one of those things that happens. And to tell a player you can't spit, they'll probably do it involuntarily. There's so many things that you will take as normal in football that are going to be out of the window, and it's going to be so hard to watch. And we'll be doing these games, and the first one will be a novelty, but 7 or 8 games in, it'll be like, oh, this is terrible. But it has to be done that way.
Well, Mark, I understand everything you're saying there, but almost being sort of devil's advocate, I mean, we don't watch football specifically to watch players high five or to hug or to spit. I'm looking forward to football coming back to watch Kevin De Bruyne play a defence-splitting ball, which will happen, and watch it for Virgil van Dijk to clear up in that majestic way of his, and watch it for Marcus Rashford's, an accelerating burst, or a great finish from Sergio Aguero. And those things will be a constant, and in the end, you will get used to not seeing those other things. And the things that I think a football fan wants to see are those things that happen on the pitch, those moments of genius, those moments of skill, a great tackle, a great piece of defensive work, a great save from, Ederson or Alisson. And those things will still be there. In the end, what we are talking about, the things that are going to be absent, they will be noticeable by the fact of their absence, because they are part and parcel of the fabric of the game, but they are peripheral parts of the fabric of the game. The fabric of the game is still there, which is shots, headers, volleys, skill, pace.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember as well that people have lost all sorts of things in their lives for the last 2 months. They can't go to pubs, they can't go to restaurants, they can't see family members, they can't go where they want, they can't travel. So I think we're conditioned now to accept that things are imperfect. And so when football resumes, I don't think the nation will be sitting there thinking, oh, this isn't worth watching because people aren't hugging each other and people aren't spitting and it lacks atmosphere. I think in the end, gratitude will outweigh grumbling. Okay,
we're going to take a break from coronavirus and football's return right now and broaden the discussion a little. After this, our final break, we'll be discussing Karl Walker, his transgressions in the lockdown and indeed his response, and also Louis van Gaal and his assessment that it was Ed Woodward who was the evil genius. Okay, we're just going to step away from the return of football right now and talk about Karl Walker, who has issued a response to the problems he's got himself into, it must be said, with his breaking of the lockdown rules. That's now 3 times in 24 hours, according to this headline. Perhaps what's the most interesting to hear, Paul, is Karl Walker's response. He said he feels harassed. He doesn't feel he can go outside of his house, and he is starting to talk about the mental health effect it's having on him. What do you make of his response?
Well, his response, I suppose you could call it a sort of a bit of a cry for help. I'm sure he's sincere because, he has illness in his family, he has severe family strains that he's trying to attend to. I think in the end, everybody would agree that he can't do what he did. But, I took a decision kind of early in this crisis, Geoff, not to pass judgment on people doing this kind of thing without knowing the circumstances. And it's a very complicated business. Yesterday we saw pictures of groups of 6 people sitting 6 inches apart with each other in parks, and that arouses debate. And then you look at Karl Walker's transgressions and you think, well, not good. breaks all the rules, but you would need to understand the full context to get a kind of accurate sense of it. But with his protestations, yeah, I mean, he obviously he does maybe think someone's following him, maybe thinks he's being monitored. He certainly seems to think he's feeling harassed. I think he's going to have to plead guilty to the charges. But again, he's raised the issue of mental health among footballers, not just among footballers, but among people who have been confined in tight spaces for 7 weeks. I would imagine the tight space he's confined in is a bit more luxurious than the tight spaces that some other people are confined in. But nonetheless, it is quite possible that he, like many other people, are under severe emotional and psychological strain. So I personally would reserve judgment on that one.
Andy, do you feel, though, given the nature of his first transgression, what we understand was hosting some sort of party, therefore he's only brought this on himself? Now, he's not made excuses in his tweet, but somewhat worryingly, he does allude to the mental health and the problems, the strain that he's clearly feeling. But even if you are sympathetic to that, which I think any of us would be, to any person, is there also an element that you feel, well, you brought this on yourself, and the reason you're a target doesn't make it right at all. The reason you're being harassed is because you gave the story writers the opportunity.
Well, I mean, that is the case, Geoff. And I think, to be fair to Karl Walker, in his statements, he does acknowledge that he brought a lot of this on himself by the original transgression, which was hosting this party. And I find it interesting, Manchester City's response to this. They are going to launch a disciplinary inquiry into that original offence, if you want to call it, in inverted commas. But they've already said that they're going to probably treat the visits to his family, I guess, with an element of compassion. That I'm sure people up and down the land will be saying, well, we won't get compassion if we break the lockdown laws and go and see our family who may be ill or elderly. So again, for that, he can't be excused. And yes, he brought some of this on himself by what happened and what he did in the early stages, that party that he hosted. But what I would say again is that, listen, he deserves all the criticism that comes his way is absolutely understandable. But I've dealt with Karl Walker for a long time. We all have, and he's always been a decent enough. He's come across a decent enough guy. He says there are reasons for these latest transgressions that have emotional, mental health reasons. Then I guess because we don't know the full details, we can't go in, full in on him and just say what a disgrace he's being. Clearly, his first offence, is inexcusable. And I guess any contravention of lockdown rules are inexcusable, but they happen. They're happening every time. They're happening, as Paul alluded to there, they were happening all over the country yesterday. I think he'd be best served, Karl Walker, by actually apologising for all of these and trying somehow to move on. And again, I get Paul's point that, the struggles of being in a confined space, but I guess everyone is in a confined mental space, aren't they? No matter how big the house you live in, everyone's in the same confined space there. And maybe that is what has got to him.
Mark, do you think Andy's right there that, it's the tweet, his response is a well thought out attempt at contrition, but perhaps it just needs a bit more apology in there.
Yeah, perhaps apologising for seeing his family. Look, I think, like Dunny says, we're all in a strange situation. 2 months now. I think a lot of people have probably done things that they, to the letter of the law, they shouldn't have done. I'm sure people have visited people they shouldn't have been to visit, or I'm sure they've been out more than once a day to exercise. I'd love to get my hair cut, but I can't. But I'm sure people have. But there's all sorts of elements to this, and I think, in the first 3 months of this year, 299 players called the PFA's helpline for mental health. And I think that's just in the first 3 months of the year. That's before the coronavirus shutdown began. So we can only imagine how many players are having difficulties right now. And I think it'd be wrong to question Karl Walker's, sentiments on this. There's all sorts of issues. It's not just, drink related or or drug-related. There's things like gaming issues now that the PFA are concerned about players spending too long locked in their rooms playing, Fortnite and FIFA 12 hours at a time. And people might think, well, that's not an addiction, but it is if it's something you can't give up. And it's all about mental health, and we have to accept that footballers have had their day-to-day routine taken away from them. And footballers, as we all know, are very kind of rigid with their routine. That they have a routine from the age of 16 to the day they retire. So I can imagine lots of footballers right now find it very difficult, despite their advantages, their luxurious lifestyle, the money they earn. Everybody's having it tough right now because of the situation we're in. So I think Karl Walker does deserve some sympathy, albeit with the fact that he has broken the rules.
It may seem a flippant point, but the chief medical officer in Scotland and and Professor Neil Ferguson, whose advice led to the whole lockdown in the first place, have both fallen foul of their own rules and regulations on this. The only reason I mention that is to show you that there's a degree of interpretation, I think, in society at large, and if people at that level of knowledge can make that kind of grievous error, it's quite understandable that Karl Walker might, which again isn't to excuse what he did, but I think that the fact that he went to see family members, it was clearly what he was trying to do was visit people who he felt he needed to see. So, but Geoff, your point about the nature of the apology, maybe you're right, but I think the public will look at this case and say, well, those are the strains we're under.
Well, a couple of things there. First of all, I'd echo your sentiments, Paul. And I would also hope that Karl Walker is okay and is receiving the support that he needs right now. And also, I wouldn't be too judgmental. I don't know about you guys. I went to a street VE party the other day. Started out very safe, social distancing, quite correct. But of course, by the end of the day, a few drinks have had, and no question, it was transgressed. No question. So who are we all to sit in judgment on others? But two people who I think we can safely assume will social distance for some time, even after this is all over, is Ed Woodward and Louis van Gaal. After the headlines this morning, now I can't help. I love Louis van Gaal. He blames evil genius Ed Woodward for his Manchester United dismissal, and talks even more in the piece. This was in the Times this morning. How he had a noose around his neck for 6 months. Now, Mark, Manchester, very much your patch. What do you make of? I mean, he's almost great copy, isn't he, Louis van Gaal?
Yeah, he's fantastic as a talker, and he, different, shall we say? I think, Louis has always been very bitter about the way it ended at Man United. But let's be honest, from the final 6 months, it was obvious he was going to be sacked because the results weren't good enough. And I think, towards the end, there were players telling us, all of us, I imagine, that they just couldn't bear playing for him anymore because he was so kind of overbearing on the training ground. It was just impossible to play for. It took all the freedom away. And I think, it's easy to blame Ed Woodward for this, but I think the only thing that Ed Woodward did that he deserves blame for is giving Van Gaal the money to sign the likes of Memphis Depay, Bastian Schweinsteiger, Matteo Darmian, Marcus Rojo, Angel Di Maria. Do I need to go on? Van Gaal's signings were terrible. His football was awful. The results were bad. So I don't think he can have anyone to blame but himself for being sacked.
But it's funny, Mark, when you talk about Ed Woodward and maybe the way that Van Gaal is saying the elements of evil genius, deviousness in getting rid of him. But bear in mind, I remember going back, so in January of 2014 or 15. Anyway, we had this football writers tribute to Jose Mourinho at the Savoy, and Louis van Gaal was a guest. He was in the Dutch job then, but he was looking to move into the Premier League, and he was basically already having, I think, clandestine negotiations with Tottenham to take over at Tottenham. And I think he was speaking to Daniel Levy or was scheduled to speak to him. And that day on the Sunday, he'd been to Stamford Bridge and he'd seen Manchester United beaten by Chelsea. Mark will probably remember the score. I think it might have been 3-0 or something like that, David Moyes. And Van Gaal over dinner that night basically said that he had been lining up to go to Spurs, but now he's thinking, hang on a minute, the big one, United might be coming up. And then began discussions and he gets the job. So in the world of king and recruitment between managers and chief executives, I don't think there's anyone who's not an evil genius out there.
Well, exactly. I mean, Paul, that's just the way that football works. And
go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, that's the way that football works. So we all know that Louis van Gaal took the Barcelona job when Bobby Robson was still in it. So Louis van Gaal knows how football works, and so do Man United. I think Ed Woodward wouldn't be doing his job if he wasn't planning ahead for the next manager when the current guy was obviously failing.
Paul, do you think it's interesting, though, that both Wayne Rooney and Ryan Giggs have recently talked about how much they have taken a leaf out of Louis van Gaal's book, perhaps more so than other managers they've had, in terms of their own desires to be coaches and to be managers?
Yeah, I'm slightly surprised at that. I mean, it's an open secret that Manchester United felt they lost control of their transfer budget and their money and their personnel when Van Gaal was there. And as Mark said earlier, they gave him far too much freedom to buy players who just, weren't good enough or didn't fit the plan. Left this clutter of Van Gaal signings for subsequent managers to deal with. And I think United feel that of all the managers that they've had since Sir Alex Ferguson retired, Van Gaal in a way was the least successful because he did such damage to the squad itself. So I think that's where the ill feeling stems from. I'm surprised that Wayne Rooney and Ryan Giggs would feel that way, although I suppose in a way Van Gaal represented a body of coaching which had probably run its course. By the time he got to Manchester United, he looked like a dated coach to me, but he came with a vast array of knowledge of different systems, I suppose, and of different eras in football, which maybe those two guys picked up on.
Mark, where do you think Manchester United are now?
I think they're getting better. Also, I think when the lockdown happened, they were just about showing signs that they might be getting it right. I think the game they should have played at Tottenham on the weekend after the lockdown would have told us an awful lot, because they'd won. I think they were unbeaten in 7 or 8 games under Solskjaer. They were knocking on the door for the top 4. But it's way too early to say that Solskjaer's turned the corner, because we don't have the full body of this season to judge him on. I remember in January they lost at home to Burnley. We thought if he lost at Tranmere, he'd be out of a job. So it's still very up and down with Solskjaer. But I think they're getting there. But the problem is right now, nobody can tell you what's going to happen in the next 6 months, 12 months, because the situation in football, the transfer market, what will happen to Pogba? Can they afford to sell him? Can anyone afford to buy him? I just think all the signs of progress are on hold now because of what the situation is going to be for the next months and years.
Andy, to round things up, how confident are you that we'll be seeing some sort of football on our screens within the next 6 weeks?
I wouldn't say I'm confident. I would genuinely say, and this sounds like, it is an incredibly fence-sitting viewpoint, I think it's probably 50-50. What will happen in Germany now over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think will basically be the template for what happens here. That will decide. If the Bundesliga gets underway again and has no particular setbacks, then I think they will start. I will say one thing, Geoff. The government and Premier League football have an appetite to get better. I think they'll do as much as they possibly can so that it's back on the screens in mid-June. Any later than that, and then it probably won't.
OK, well, I can tell you what you will be seeing on our screens fairly shortly. We have a special evening, a night in with Jamie Carragher for Sky VIP customers. You can register. I can assure you he looks nothing like that now. You won't be going around his house. We'll be back next week with Sunday's supplement, debating the big talking points of the week. Hopefully, football's return will be on there. But for now, I'd like to thank our guests for making the effort, joining us from home. Paul Hayward, Andy Dunn and Mark Ogden. Chaps, thank you very much indeed for letting us into your home, and also to our viewers too for letting us into your home. We'll see you next time.